Good morning. I'm Teresa Cunha. I'm the Associate Director of the Democratic Governance Programs at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation here at the Harvard Kennedy School. So before we have our welcome remarks, I'm just going to make some housekeeping announcements. This morning's and afternoon's plenary sessions will be held in this classroom and are being audio and video recorded and will be posted online after the symposium. The breakout sessions will be audio recorded and note takers will be in the room for the purpose of our own documentation. Today's event is not off the record because we hope to share insights from all of you to a wider audience that is also working in this issue. Bathrooms are located by the elevator. And if you have any questions related to logistics, please ask me, Dan against that wall, and Melissa right here to my right. And last but not least, a photographer will be present throughout the day. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mark Guerin.
Thank you, Teresa, and good morning. I am Mark Guerin. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics, and on behalf of our dean here at the Kennedy School, Doug Elmendorf, we warmly welcome you to the Kennedy School, and with my colleagues at the Ash Center and Shorenstein Center, the Institute of Politics, we're excited to really have this day together. So we warmly welcome all of you to this conversation. Last night, the Institute of Politics was happy to host a little reception in our living room, and there was so much good and lively conversation, even before the wine was served, that someone said to me, you know, it feels like a wedding. We're all here together. There's so many friends from around the country. It feels like a wedding. And I thought, well, that's sort of an interesting and apt observation, because in many ways it is. We've brought together people from around the country in common pursuit, those who bring practitioners and activists and advocates perspective, technologists, business people, media, academics, really in common bond and common purpose to move this very frustrating and concerning levels of civic participation to 80%. And like a wedding, to engage with one another. So into that spirit, I warmly welcome you, and to torture the metaphor a little bit more of a wedding. It's 9 a.m. Get some coffee here, everybody. But we all know that we're in this for the long haul, like a marriage, right? This is, okay, come on. It was on my drive home before I watched Rudy Giuliani on here. But this will take some time. And the policy prescriptions that are part of this, but at least from my perspective, from my seat at the Institute of Politics, there's no better group for an intensive day like this. There's no more important time for our democracy, for all of us to gather for the kind of policy prescriptions, highlights on state activities, opportunities that exist in technology, and to really shift the culture, profile what states are doing, engaging young Americans in voting. So the panels before us today really blend all of that. I'm particularly proud to welcome back a predecessor of mine, the former IOP director, former Secretary of State in Kentucky, Trey Grayson. We're glad you're back here. Welcome back. We have colleagues from the IOP that will be participating in the sessions. John Della Volpe is our director of polling. He will be very current perspectives on millennials and their capacity and their interest and concerns about voting. Ashley Spillane, who's been a great advisor to our Community Action Committee, bringing her experience from Rock the Vote. And it's great to see so many friends here who we've been engaged in this, from Alan Casey, who I serve with on commissions, to Ian Simmons, and our good work together for the National Advisory Board for the College on Civic Participation. And I thank all of you for being here. With the Ash Center, I think I can speak for all of us that have been a part of this convening, the Ash Center and the Shorenstein Center and the Institute of Politics. This would not have been possible without the leadership and the real commitment from our academic dean, our grandfather, who brings his own scholarship to this area, his own personal interest. But in my short 2 months here, I've observed the depth of his commitment to these issues. In convenings around his conference room table, he whips out his tablet, he takes note, he asks tough questions, he organizes, and this is beyond just the role of an academic dean to convene a symposium. This is someone who very much is committed to it, and for that, among the many things, we thank you, Archon, and warmly welcome you to the podium.
Thanks very much for that very kind introduction, Mark, and thanks everyone for coming. And I'd like to open just by thanking a few people on the ASH team, among others, who made this whole thing possible. Melissa Donello, Teresa Acuna, Natalia Chavez, Dan Harsha, and some other folks who, I think a lot of people in this room have organized meetings of this scale before. You know how much it takes, so a big hand for them. So our democracy depends on voting, but it's a sad fact that for many, many decades now, the number of people not voting at all has far exceeded the number supporting any victorious presidential candidate by a lot. This indicates a deep, deep problem with our democracy, and that's what we're here to talk about and try to make some first steps towards solving today. So I thought I'd open the morning and these remarks with just a little bit of a treatment about how we're doing so far. 56% of the voting age population in the United States voted in the 2016 elections. So if we were to get to this goal of 80%, we'd have to increase that voting participation rate by roughly 25%. Internationally, the US is not doing so well at all. Almost every other country, not every other country, but most of them with stable democracies in the OECD have far higher participation rates than the United States. At the top of the list are Belgium, Sweden, Denmark, some of the Northern European countries, but all of Central Europe is ahead of us. Behind us are Japan, Chile, Slovenia, I think, and a couple of others. The US is 28 out of 35 in the OECD in terms of citizens participating in elections, near the bottom of the list. That is not a proud statistic for a country that has been for some time in the business of trying to export democracy. Maybe we ought to be importing a little. The good news is that part of America has already reached 80%. So maybe we can all go home. The bad news, though, is that it's families with incomes above $150,000 a year that have reached that 80% threshold. So they're already there. The rest of America, unfortunately, is not. Here's where folks in different household income categories would have to go to get to the 80% category. For those of you who don't know the demographics, about somewhere between 15 and 18% of the U.S. population lives in families that make over $150,000, closer to 15%. Median income is around $50,000. Household income is around $50,000. So at the middle, right, about 17, 18% is what we'd have to increase it by to get to the 80% goal. If you're in a very poor household, making less than 15 grand a year or 10 grand a year, we'd have to really dramatically increase it by 33%, 40%. Big, big differences. So let's talk about race for a minute. White non-Hispanic Americans, voting rates pretty far from 80%, right? It's about 65% in 2016. We'd have to kick it up by 15% to hit our 80% goal. That's a lot easier to do than for other racial categories in the United States. African Americans are actually vote at higher rates than you might think, right? Have to kick it up by about 20%. Asian Americans, it'd be 30%, 10% more. And Asians and Hispanics are at the lowest levels, a little bit less than 50% of citizens voting in 2016. Generations. 65 years and older, they're almost there, right? The people on Social Security, 73, 74%, we'd only have to increase their voting age participation by about 6%, and we'd hit our goal of 80%. Younger folks, however, as you know, not quite there yet, especially college age, and we'll have a little bit more to say about that in a moment. 18 to 24-year-old folks at 43% voting rate. So we almost have to double it to hit the 80% goal. So huge differences across generation, as huge differences across income, and huge differences across race. States are famously, as Brandeis said, laboratories of democracy. Some states are almost there. My good friend and colleague Catherine Sicking's longtime state of Minnesota is at 75%. Here are some select states, the top 4 and the bottom 4, along with California thrown in for interest. The top 4, Minnesota, Maine, New Hampshire, and Colorado, are almost there. You wouldn't actually have to do all that much to get it to 80%. The states at the bottom of the list, Hawaii's a little bit of an outlier, lots of islands, so. Hawaii's a little bit of an outlier, but bottom states you'd have to move quite a lot, and even at the middle of the country's largest state, California, you'd have to move quite a lot to get to 80%. You'd have to increase it by almost a quarter. So 80% sounds good. I think almost everybody in the room wouldn't be here if you weren't at least sympathetic to that goal. But why would you be sympathetic to that goal of full participation in the United States? I think that part of the conversation today ought to be being more articulate about the reasons so that we're not only convinced ourselves, but we can explain it to other people. What's good about full participation? I think part of the work is developing that account, but here are some initial bricks for what's good about full participation. Equality. Political equality is the first thing. One sense of political equality is the right to vote, which is widespread, but I'd argue not fully complete. We need to keep working on that. But another sense of equality is whether people exercise that right to vote, and that's what we're talking about here today. Another reason, more from the language and ideas on the conservative side of the spectrum rather than the liberal side, is responsibility. I think people have a responsibility to vote, and we should remind them of that every single day and recreate that civic ethos. A third idea, which is a little bit more complicated, is responsiveness. The government might be more responsive to what the people want if a lot more people voted. What does it mean for a government to be responsive? When government is responsive, it means that the more people, we the people, the greater the percentage of people who want some policy to happen, the greater the chance that government will do that thing. An unresponsive government, on the other hand, is one whose public policies don't at all correspond to what people want. So, couple lines here. The green line, on the horizontal axis is the percentage of citizens who want something, and on the y-axis is the percentage chance that the government will actually do that thing. So the green line is a responsive government, and the red line is an unresponsive government. It's flat. It doesn't matter how many people want a war or don't want a war, the government's just going to do whatever the hell it wants. Great series of papers and a great book by my friend at Princeton University, now at UCLA, Marty Gillen's, called Affluence and Influence. He looks at how responsive government is over the last few decades. And he finds that government is not at all responsive to what people want when there are kind of class differences, when poor people want things a certain way and wealthier people want a different thing. On those set of policies, government is not at all responsive to what the majority wants. It's that flat line, that flat black line. So it's red, unresponsive across many, many policies. However, when you just look at the top 10% of the population, what they want, Marty finds that government is very, very responsive to what they want. And that may have something to do with the first chart that I showed you, that families above $150,000 a year vote a lot more frequently than everybody else. It may have to do with money in politics, that they also contribute to political campaigns a lot more than everybody else. A fourth reason to favor full participation is institutional trust. When the namesake of this university, John F. Kennedy, was president, about 75% of the population said we can trust in government to do what's right all of the time or most of the time. And they said about 70% said that they think that government is run for the benefit of all rather than a few special interests. Today, those numbers are at all-time lows. About 20% of the US population trusts the government to do what's right all of the time or most of the time, and trust that government is run for the benefit of all rather than a few special interests. I hope that with a thicker civic ethos, with all Americans participating, they would demand their government become more trustworthy, and in the fullness of time, government would become more trustworthy. Now, today, we want to really set our sights high and suspend the cynicism, the negativity about this super ambitious project of trying to increase participation to something like a fulsome level of 80 or 90%. The opposite of creativity is cynicism, and we want to focus on the creativity today, open hearts and open minds. Now, there are an amazing set of people in this room. It's said that among intellectuals and academics, people are able to see only as far as they can because they stand on the shoulders of giants. This conference, we're all standing on many, many shoulders of people in this room and outside of it to be able to reach out far and see as far as we can on this goal of full participation. The conference itself, the idea of an 80% goal, I first heard of it when I talked to Seth Flaxman and Kay Contreras, and then later on Jenny, Democracy Works and Common Cause had this idea of a moonshot. What would a moonshot in democracy look like? And they thought, well, maybe a moonshot would be something like 80% participation. So it's a fantastic idea, and I'm just delighted that we're able to convene ourselves to talk about that idea and move it forward a little bit. Here are just some of the amazing groups represented here in this room. There are many other logos that we couldn't find from the organizations that you come from. But here are just a sampling of them. Please don't be offended if your logo is not up here. Many, many different kinds of groups coming from many, many directions. So take today as an opportunity to connect with one another and meet people and learn about their work who you didn't know. There are several streams of very different communities here that have a bigger common interest but don't often talk to one another. There are many progressive activists, some conservatives, fewer conservatives than we would have liked, but some. People from the technology community, people from the civic engagement, very nonpartisan civic engagement community. And so we'll be working on lots of different streams of work to try to get to this 80% goal. And one of the objectives of today is to get people out of their particular focus, kind of areas of focus and targets, to think about other tools and a broader picture. The most familiar tool to many of us will be policy. Even there, and we'll talk quite a bit about policy, but even there, think about policies that you wouldn't ordinarily think of. I had the good fortune of interviewing Eric Holder on Monday, and I asked him what he thought it would take to get to 80%. And he thought, well, we should just move voting to the weekend rather than have it on a Tuesday. It's only on a Tuesday because I think people had to get to market, and it takes a while to get that there on a horse. That's not such a relevant consideration anymore, and it may have some depressing effects in terms of voter turnout. I asked my friend David Moss, who's an historian of American democracy, what he would do, and he said, well, I would get rid of the Australian ballot. So if you look at voting participation over the long course of American history, it is at 80% before the Civil War up until 1890 Reconstruction, and then it kind of drops down to approximately levels that we had now. There are many, many changes, of course, over that period, but one of them was moving to a secret ballot. And David thinks if we didn't have the secret ballot, just get rid of that, it might increase voting some. So pretty radical ideas on the table. Technology. As you know, there has been a revolution in social media and technology, and also the technology of getting people out to vote. A great book about this is from a few years ago, Sasha Eisenberg's Victory Lab, which is a deep exploration of exactly how the campaigns have been able to use technology and data really to very, very systematically increase voter participation. Unfortunately, it's only the voter participation of people that's likely to support their party, but still important insights there. Culture is very, very important. I think one of the changes that's happened over the late 20th century is a decline in civic commitment and civic culture for participation in elections as well as other forms of participation. And then organizations. Obviously, all kinds of organizations are critical to mobilizing people and getting them engaged in the electoral process. Many of us are familiar with the most obvious kinds of organizations in that regard, political parties and advocacy campaigns. And we need to work on those and figure out how to organize folks to an 80% goal. But another set of organizations that may be less obvious are non-political organizations, some civic, but just some regular organizations like companies and universities. Imagine if every company had a policy to get all of its employees to register to vote, and to facilitate all of its customers participating in the political process. Imagine if every high school in the country were to commit to a class on civics education and a process for all graduating seniors to register to vote. Imagine if every university were to commit to registering all of its students to vote and facilitating the voting process. What would that look like? Well, my friend Edie Goldenberg from the Ford School at the University of Michigan, where's Edie? Over here. There she is, has begun this process with the Big Ten Challenge. So the Big Ten Challenge, beginning at the University of Michigan, is to challenge units within the University of Michigan and other Big Ten schools to commit to registering 90% of their students to vote. And the Ford School and 5 other units at the University of Michigan have committed to that goal for 2018. Pretty cool, right? So that's the beginning of an organizational approach that's quite different from what advocacy organizations and political parties do. I'm just delighted to be able to announce today that the Kennedy School is joining Edie, and next year we are going to commit to registering 90% of our students to vote in the 2018 election. Anybody from a university, in all of your organizations, you should commit to that kind of goal, and Edie will be very happy to tell you about the mechanics of what that's like and how to pull it off. Today is just one step, and as I was saying yesterday, the purpose of this meeting is basically a trial balloon, is to try to put a flag in the ground and say, hey, who's interested in 80% participation as a goal? See who shows up, have a set of conversations about it, and see how much energy there is for doing more things. And if there's a lot of energy, then more things will happen. No matter what, these things will happen. We will issue some proceedings. There will be a participant list. You already have that. We will promote work that's related to this from people in the room. And then depending on what the energy is, and I suspect from the conversation last night in the IOP living room and some this morning, that the energy will be high. We'll be trying to figure out some next steps to move the research agenda and the civic agenda forward. Now, I think it is appropriate to say something about partisanship at this point. For most of the 20th century in America, in Congress, in the public, there was a lot of overlap between left and right. There was a big purple zone. These days, there is very, very little overlap. Political leaders in Congress, there is no overlap in terms of how they're voting on ideology measures. And there is no doubt that the political process and the electoral process itself has become a partisan matter. It always has been. I think it's even more the case now. We see that in Republican redistricting initiatives after the 2010 census. We see that in, I don't know how many people saw this Washington Post article about the Maryland case, in which the Democrats are are the defendants on redistricting, on gerrymandering, and Democratic Governor Martin O'Malley in a deposition said, as Democratic governor, I thought it was my duty to gerrymander as much as possible for the Democrats. I thought it was my job to do that, right? I think that's a deep mistake as a matter of political ethics, right? But that's what he thought his job was. So I think our job is to create a set of arguments and to convince people that they should be for full participation as an American matter, not as a partisan matter. Thanks to my friend Arthur, I had the opportunity to read Lincoln, the novel, over the last week. I wouldn't recommend trying to read it in a week, by the way. Give yourself a little more time if you want to read that book. Now, partisanship is at its highest since any time since the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. And I was reminded in reading that book and thinking about this conference of the last part of the first inaugural address that's on the eve of the Civil War in 1861. And he's worried a lot about partisanship. And he's trying to convince people on the North and South not to go to war. And he famously says, we are friends. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. The passions have strained, but they must not break our bonds of commitment. The mystic chords of memory stretching from every graveyard to from every battlefield to patriot grave, to every living soul and every hearthstone, all across our land. You will yet swell to the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as they surely will be, by the better angels of our natures. And so a part of this meeting is to ask you, is a thought that the beginning of that chorus, maybe its first line, is the thought that we should all participate as Americans in the political process, no matter what our differences. Maybe that's the first common thing about what joins us in this union. And to ask you, of course in this meeting, but more importantly after this meeting, to tap the better angels of your nature, to spread that message, even as you have other projects which are not in common with other partisans. It's fully, we fight for lots and lots of different things against other Americans. And that's right, that's part of the democratic process. But for that to work, we have to have some things in common with everyone. And these days, it's really, really hard to figure out what those things are. And maybe one of them is the idea that every single American should participate in the political process. And that's the proposition of this conversation and how I think we should move forward, the full participation proposition. So now let's get to work. And here is the agenda for the day. So there's too many people here to have one big conversation which everybody is fully engaged. So we've organized 3 different streams of work in the morning and 3 different streams of work in the afternoon that people will have to participate in. There are the morning sessions, there's 3 of them in parallel, about creating a cultural shift, about mobilizing non-voters, and about states at the cutting edge. And then the afternoon parallel sessions will be about technology and social media, the next generation, young Americans, and universal registration and universal voting, which is Miles's little spin on the idea that you should be required by law to vote. So we'll have folks that now come up to introduce the 3 morning sessions, just for really short talks, 5 to 7 minutes, about what each of the 3 sessions is about, to give you a better idea about what you want to participate in. So Trey Grayson, former Secretary of State from Kentucky, will come up and talk about reimagining participation. Chuck Rocha about closing the participation gap. And Doug Chapin at the University of Minnesota, formerly at Pew Research, will talk about states at the cutting edge.
Thanks, Archon, and everybody here at Harvard.
Have a seat.
That's what I'm going to do from here.
Okay, cool.
So I'm doing from here. Listen, she's the boss.
Yeah, she is, no doubt.
It's great to be back here. It's the first time in the new building since it's all been complete. This is extraordinary new campus for the Kennedy School. And I think a day like today wouldn't really have been possible in our old building configuration. There wouldn't have been any space. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things and introduce a couple of things. So I'm here to talk about culture shift. And so there's a couple of things that I think to kind of frame this, to kind of recruit you to come to our room. So first is, one of the challenges whenever we're talking about election issues, and Art kind of alluded to this, is a lot of folks in politics and elections focus and view everything through the framework of winning and losing. And so when you're trying to convince a lawmaker to change a law, the lawmaker got elected under the current rules. That meant those rules worked in that particular setting. And that's just something we have to keep in mind. And campaigns and political parties exist to win elections. They don't exist to get the 80% unless they view that in their right, that's in their best interests. And so we have to keep that in mind. And if we can somehow broaden the folks involved in this, political parties and campaigns and candidates are important, and we can't ignore them, but we have to get beyond that framework. The second is we got to have everybody in the room. It bothers me that as a Republican, as a conservative, as someone from the right, that not enough of my folks want to be in a room like this. It's always been a struggle. Now, I was always appreciative of the NAS conferences. The Voter Participation Committee of the Secretary of State is always the biggest committee. We've got a big event. I've seen Secretary Simon. We got an event in a couple of weeks that NAS is putting on, a full-day event on how to increase turnout. So secretaries generally are interested in these things, but it's a problem. Now that being said, when there's 100 progressives in a room and not too many conservatives, the conservatives who aren't in the room might wonder, what are y'all up to? And maybe you're focusing on that first thing I talked about, winning and losing, not broadening it. So we got to get everybody in the room. And we can do that, but we have to figure out who are some key players, are there some influence makers, somebody who's very well regarded, or others or groups or institutions, and just kind of build this coalition more gradually. I think to shift culture, we have to really focus on civics education. You know, getting back, there's some folks in this room for whom that's a real priority. There's been a lot of effort over that in the last couple of decades, but getting back to having more civics instruction, civics engagement in schools, I think is part of a solution. We also need to think about how do we frame things with language. I think about the success, you know, in early 2000s, there was some terms you don't hear anymore, gay marriage, same-sex marriage, all of a sudden it became marriage equality. And I think that shift in language all of a sudden caused more people to rally behind that concept. And so are there things that we care about that if we frame them differently, or we gave them a different name, could cause them to have broader support? An issue that's near and dear to me right now is AVR. I don't like the name automatic voter registration. It scares some people. It's really not even accurate. Anyway, it's not automatic, it's automated. And if we frame it as saying, by automating it, we're going to get more people on a list that's with more accurate information in a more secure manner, all of a sudden that's something that you can cross party lines and get some more interest in. And then, oh, by the way, we'll have more people on the list. That was the first thing I said. So how do you frame things? How do you describe things? Think about that as we're going forward. That can help shift culture. I'm really excited. I know we have some conversations about norming. I mean, some of the work from political scientists that Sasha wrote about and others. And I remember being on a commission that Circle put together after the 2012 election of political scientists. If you think your friends vote, you are more likely to have voted because you think that's normal. If you think your neighbors are going to vote, you're more likely to be shamed, and things like that. So how do we use that concept of norming to shift that culture? And then finally, I think as sort of how do we broaden or engage the institutions? Again, Archon talked about this, but I think again about how the business community has embraced, and a lot of businesses have embraced support for non-discrimination laws because they view it through the lens of talent attraction. Both for the company, they want to have the best talent, and they want to be known as a place that anybody can come work there. But they also want to know that their community is the kind of community that embraces that. And so you're seeing across the country local and state chambers of commerce endorsing non-discrimination laws. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they thought, oh great, now I'm just creating another way for me to get sued. No, now it's, I'm doing this because it's better for my community, it's better for my company. Some of that's self-interest. They want to make more money. It's about, there's profits there. A lot of it's about profits. But then there's also branding, because people, they now think, oh, there's value in this. So if there's companies, if there's chambers of commerce that believe, we don't get enough in our community, well, because we don't vote, so politicians don't come here. Well, if you had higher turnout, maybe you'd get more attention from Frankfurt, in my state, or from the State House in Beacon Hill, here. So how do we engage those institutions in a way of doing that? And I think there's one example I'd just like to just do a quick overview is the Bauer, Ginsburg, Obama Presidential Commission on Election Administration. I served on that. Because Ben Ginsberg, who is a partisan Republican, agreed to do that. That was a signal to the right, oh, wait a minute, this is a serious endeavor. We're going to pay attention to this. When the president announced his effort in that, I called up Ben and said, hey, I'd like to do that. I was the IOP director then. And Ben's like, good, we were going to call you. And so we spent a year traveling around, and we focused on lines. And that was something admittedly, Republicans didn't care a lot about lines, but we just focused on lines. And out of that, we talked about we needed more data, we need to have a mind shift. And so what has happened? Foundations, individuals spent money to implement our recommendations. We have changed the culture of election administration to be more data-oriented. We have changed the expectations of the public that 30 minutes is, anything longer than 30 minutes is a failure and unacceptable. And it's continuing to change state laws all across, and it's done in a bipartisan way. So I think that might be an interesting example. It's narrow, lines is not 80%, but it's an instructive opportunity of all these things that I've talked about, many of the things I've talked about, of framing and making sure everybody's in the room, and making sure people are coupled on engaging institutions, philanthropists, foundations. So those are just some thoughts on culture. I think all this is woven together, but culture is really important, I think, in order to advance this. So thanks for coming out today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you and hear all this conversation and see some old friends.
Oh, he's getting a slide. All right.
Yeah.
So welcome everybody. I will be brief. Let me get my thing out because I'm an organizer, and the one thing that my mama taught me was free is being on time and starting my stopwatch to make sure I don't go over my time. This comes from Pew. You'll also know that from as soon as I opened up my mouth that I am not an intellectual and I am not a scholar. I am representing the grassroots of doing campaigns for 27 years. It's good to see so many good friends. Natalie, Mr. Simon, a lot of my friends who I've done campaigns with around the country. And I think that this is one of the most unique things I've participated in. I think you have some grand ideas. I think you have a long way to go, but I think that there's a way to get there if you do it right. And I want to give you some things to whet your appetite as we go into these breakouts and talk about mobilizing non-voters and thinking about non-voters. It's good to see you, sister. And think about what I've seen. And I thought when I was coming here this morning, I had a late night last night in D.C. With the Year of the Latina and lifting up the voices of Latinas. The 1 minute so you know where I'm coming from instead of just a big old Mexican who sounds like a redneck is that my first campaign was Ann Richards back in the late 80s in Texas. I now own the largest person of color-owned political consulting firm in North America. My entire staff are made up of immigrants and children of immigrants. We do the best culturally competent work in the electoral space in the United States because we talk about the community. We lift up the community's voices. We go into the community, hence why I think that y'all nice people were dumb enough to ask me to come here. B, there's lots of things that are happening in the country that just need to be connected and funded, that are being done at a really good level. There's lots of people training immigrants to run for office. There's lots of people trying to register people, but we've become such a consultant class and such an elite class of people doing this work that the money never sometimes flows down to the people who are actually doing some of the most inventive work because you have this consultant class who've driven the money to a certain group of people who all do the same things over and over. And I've been doing it long enough where I've just seen it for a long time, and I'm the oldest Mexican in the room and made enough money to just tell everybody to kiss my ass. The second piece is that when you do this work, you can figure out that there's really opportunities and some of the struggles that are out there, right? And so this should lead you into some of why people don't participate. This comes from Pew. If you want to look this up, this is a great study. I only took two of my favorite slides. Of interest in politics and government from frequent voters to semi-frequent voters to occasional voters to rare voters to unregistered voters. People who don't participate in the system don't participate for one major reason, first and foremost, that's not up there. It's so simplistic, I didn't want to add it to my slides. And what is that reason? The number one reason is nobody asks. Nobody asks. And guess what happens now? Is that nobody's asking in the right way. Because my entire staff are people of color under 30, and they could not be more different than me than like black and white. and the way we consume information, talk to each other, and share information differently. And that's some of the new things we should be talking about in some of these breakout classes. I tell the story of when I come home in the evening, I turn on a 72-inch TV. I will have me a beer or a whiskey, all depending on how bad my day was. I will watch MSNBC or a baseball game, and I will consume information and probably read news on my phone at the same time. My staff have never seen a landline. My staff don't even know where to buy a newspaper, I found out last week. And they don't own a television. I said they don't own a television, which seems stupid to me. How do they watch baseball if they ain't on TV? And we're trying to get those people to register to vote, and then we want to get them to participate in the process, right? So think about that when we're doing it. That's a big part of the obstacle. This breakdown here is how people think about when Pew asks a whole lot of folks, so why aren't you participating? A lot of people feel disconnected from government. They feel like it's broke. People who voted once or twice kind of feel more engaged. They think everything's kind of crooked and that there's not a piece for them. They want to feel some ownership in the process, and we've never, A, taken the time to explain that to them, and B, if we went to do that, we were talking above them or around them or not even where they're participating by running a 30-second commercial on network TV. The next part of this, the next slide, how do I move this thing over there? Just down? All right, perfect. There's only 2 slides. I was only allowed 2. Take this in. Unregistered, non-registered, again, is more than 40% of the unregistered and rare voters care who wins the presidential election. We all have talked about throughout my tenure of how we have to go get these dropout voters, right? And because things are so run on budgets, we spend a lot of time, and I write budgets for campaigns every single day, or nonprofits, where how can we maximize what little bit of money to go register the people that we need to go register? So we first talk about the prime voters. There's nothing worse in America than an old prime voter. I'm sick of them, I'm tired of them, that's the only people we normally go talk to, or we have the money to go talk to. If we really have some money, we'll go talk to drop-off voters. And then those drop-off voters who don't participate. We never get to an infrequent voter. For God's sakes, ever get to, in a regular campaign, to go talk to registered people to vote. I remember, and I was so blessed and fortunate to be a general consultant for Bernie Sanders. And I worked for Bernie for 16 months, helped run the day-to-day of the presidential race with Tad and with Jeff. And when we had people sign up on our website to volunteer in Texas, and I'm from Texas, as you know, I was really going to go through the data. Because me and some of my friends have tried to figure out Texas for a long time, how to get those numbers up. It just kills me every day because it's home and it's pride. We found that there were 158,000 people who had signed up on the Bernie website. By September, we hadn't opened an office. We hadn't spent $1. It was just that natural phenomenon of back to this presidential election excitement, right? So I wanted to break down those numbers and figure out who these people were. They're in my home state. There's this crazy white guy from Vermont who's exciting people in Texas. I know my people. He ain't excited about people, but they felt it, right? A, they were very young. B, 38% of that 158,000 people had never voted before. Never voted before. And I tell you that story to tell you this, right? That's just one opportunity of when you're thinking about engaging a non-voter. How do you get somebody involved? The other piece is something that's very personal to them. You've seen this gun issue and what's happened in Florida, right? That's something that's garnering attention. You see groups out there doing amazing work like Unidos. Unidos who has programs to go into high schools, mainly Latino high schools, to get them to sign up before they're even 18 because they're going to be 18 before the next election. That's kind of groundbreaking work that we had the money to fund Unidos, and they were in every Latino school in Florida. Florida would look a lot different than it looks today. Voto Latino, who we did some texting programs for, we texted every kid, every Latino kid in one county in Florida between the ages of 18 and 29 a link to their cell phones. I could buy that data. And I've got the technology and run text messages within my firm. And we just delivered it to them. It costs 15 cents a piece, which is much cheaper than a $21 doorknob. To say, if you want to register to vote, if you want to fight back, if you want your voice to be heard, just click the link and register to vote. We just spent $2,000 to register a couple hundred kids. But just thinking outside the box. So let your thoughts flow when you get into the next exercise. But know that people still very much just feel disconnected to the process. And that's the reason that they're not participating in the ways that they need to. But it's more so than, don't get drunk down, and I know all of you people, some of you are my friends, and you're way too damn smart for your own good. Don't just think about the semantics of why it hasn't happened. And think about the great messaging poll and focus group we can do to go figure out how we go get them, right? We spend so much of our time wasting it on what's the perfect message to go get to them, and then we run a 30-second TV commercial and nobody's watching. If you don't want the truth, you shouldn't ask me to come here. Think about the new way to deliver that message. Is it a text message? Nothing's ever going to replace knocking on those doors. You know, the work that people are doing, I talk about Onedas because they knock on doors in Florida. I talk about people who've done voter registration. The old Southwest voter back in the day when I was youth in Texas. Like when people knocked on your door and you had a conversation with somebody and could relate, that's the best way to register. It's just really expensive. And can you really get to people who are that spread out these days? But can you run a layered communication where you can walk and chew gum at the same time? Where you knock on some doors where they're concentrated together to do it efficiently, and also be text messaging them, but then also sending them information on the internet. We've been doing some testing with some of our nonprofits on do they react the same way from a Facebook ad to a Pandora ad to another ad if they will text, to see if we're gathering where these young people are consuming information, and then how we turn them into a registrant, and then we have to turn that registrant into a voter. Let some of that sink in today when you're having these conversations and ask hard questions. Ask why aren't they participating and what looks different between Texas and Minnesota. The first thing that jumps out at me is there's a whole lot of white people in Minnesota. And there's a whole lot of brown people in Texas. And why is California 10% higher than Texas? Well, I know that because I'm an old man. Because 25 years ago, there was a ballot initiative where we all in this room spent $40 million registering and educating and turning out Latinos that turned that state blue for effing ever, right? And then that's been passed down on generations. That money's never been spent in Texas, right? And now when it's spent in Texas, it can't be spent just knocking on doors and running 30-second TV commercials because the electorate has changed. Think about how your kids consume information when you're having these conversations. And I will tell you this in my wrap-up, is that I've got a son who's grown, who I've had full custody of since he was 3 months old. He's 27 years old now. And he's got 2 beautiful, if you follow me on social media, 2 Rocha boys, twin boys, and they're the light of my life. And the way that they interact, and the way that my son, who was very much a Bernie bro and so much Mexican, the whole thing, right? He's his daddy's son to the core, is that he wants to fight back and he feels empowered right now. And I think there's a unique time in history that we stand in right now with young people, whether it's guns, whether it's Trump, whether it's feeling disenfranchised, whatever, that we can take advantage of in a good way, back to your point this morning of having some skin in the game, because they feel like that they know that there's a special point in history and that they're a part of it, and they feel like for the first time that voting does matter, because Donald Trump, in most of their opinions, is an example of what matters if you don't vote. But then there's other people out there who just want to feel like there's a way to fight back. And so think about that when you're talking about the engagement, and thank you very much for your time.
Wow, how do you follow that? I feel like the guy who came out on stage after Hamilton performed at the Tonys. Notice me, please. No, thank you very much. It's good to see so many folks here. My name is Doug Chapin with the University of Minnesota. In thinking about the session on states at the cutting edge, I want to remember a conversation that I had years ago. I worked on a campaign, met someone in Southern Virginia from Farmville. And he said, Doug, do you know what GOTV is? And I said, well, yeah, GOTV is get out the vote. He says, no, but you know what GOTV means? And I said, it means getting people out the vote. He says, no, Doug. He says, GOTV means taking people's get out and turning it into a vote. Very often, when we talk about motivating people to vote, whether they're regular voters, infrequent voters, new voters, we sort of stop thinking about it as soon as we get them to the point where they're ready to turn that get out into a vote. But the truth is, once you've made that decision to cast a ballot, there is still ways to go. My friends and colleagues, Dana Chisnell and Whitney Quesenberry, talk a lot about this notion of a voter's journey. Once you make the decision to participate in elections, you have to navigate a journey. You have to register, you have to figure out how to register, you have to convert that registration into knowing where to cast your ballot, you have to learn what's on your ballot, you have to cast your ballot, and if you're the kind of person who wants to know, you want to track to make sure that that vote was cast and counted. And for too long, that entire process has been a black box to voters. I talk a lot about how voting has changed in this country. I think in the old days, voting was a little bit like going to your local library. You went to a familiar place, you saw familiar people, you got something you were looking for, you went home, it was close by. Nowadays, in our effort to make the process more convenient for voters, it's also sometimes a little more complex. And it can feel like a test you can fail. It's a little bit like a trip to the DMV. Fortunately, in the very recent decade, we've started to see states recognize the power of the voter's journey and think about ways to make that process work for voters, either habitual voters, irregular voters, or what my friend Cameron used to call cicada voters, the types who only return every election. The amazing thing is that states, those laboratories of democracy, are doing a lot to help think about improving the voter's journey. I see lots of folks in the room, state officials, civic technologists, who have thought about how we take the election process on the supply side, supplying information, supplying elections to voters, and make it convenient for them, whether it's changing how they register to vote, automated voter registration, election day registration, changing where you get your ballot, when you get your ballot, how you get your ballot, how you learn about what's on your ballot. It used to be that you just knew that you went to the local community center. Now, you can use your phone, your computer, in many different languages, text message, what have you. You can find out not only where to vote, what's on your ballot, but also what the rules and deadlines are for casting that ballot. That didn't just happen magically. That happened because of the hard work of folks in the states, sometimes with the cooperation of their legislators, sometimes in spite of the cooperation of their legislators, to bring changes to the field of elections. And so in our session, States at the Cutting Edge, we're going to talk about innovations in registration, in how ballots are delivered to voters and how voters return those ballots to states, about how state election officials are convincing their legislators and other policymakers to invest money in new technology and new approaches to voting that will help voters, so that we can go back and so that we can take that get out that we think we're going to see in 2018 and beyond, so that we can take the passion that Chuck talks about, so that we can take the conversation that Trey mentioned, so that we can take the energy that we hope will emanate from this room and drive voters through the process, not just as someone who's interested in being a voter, but actually succeeds in doing so. I hope I've made you forget Hamilton, probably not. But if that sounds interesting to you, please join us at the Cutting Edge. Thank you.